Okay, so we've looked at some theories of language, the genetics of language, and whether animals have a language. Let's think about when language may have evolved. Now, we saw from the genetic data, if you've seen that screencast on language genes, that the FOXP2 gene, which is believed to be implicated in the evolution of language, changed about 150 years ago, which dates language possibly about 150,000 years ago. So our species have had language for that long. But it's also possible that we were not the only species that had true human language. One of the physiological features of speaking animals, of linguistic animals, is that we have a particular bone in the throat, which you can see here, called the hyoid bone. This should be in a fairly low position. It's important for speech. It essentially is a kind of like framework which allows the vocal cords to be open to allow them to work properly and allow speech. The hyoid bone is forensically important as well because it tends to be used to indicate strangulation. If the thyroid bone is broken, it tends to suggest that the person has been strangled. But it's also important for speech. It seems that from anatomical investigations of Neanderthal people, or Homo neanderthalensis, that these individuals have the hyoid bone in the correct place, which suggests that they had some kind of speech, and also it suggests, genetic evidence suggests that Neanderthals also had the similar version to FOXP2 that we had. So both these bits of converging evidence are suggesting that maybe 150,000 years is where language had, and it may be that at that time, when there was both Homo sapiens, just to be clear, Homo neanderthalensis or Neanderthal men weren't our ancestors. We were coexisting with them in northern Europe over a few thousand years ago, and it seems that both of these two species had some kind of language. Whether Homo sapiens, our species, language was better than theirs, we don't know, but at least it seems that they had some kind of language. There are many commonalities between languages, which suggests that language happened only once, and every single language, if you like, evolved from one language, which was a common ancestor of all languages. In the Bible, which was one of the early theories about the way that language was created, the belief was that people tried to build some kind of tower, a Tower of Babel, to get to God. God got quite cross about this, and in order to prevent all the people coming together and trying to, if you like, gang up on him again, he made them all speak different languages, which meant that they could not communicate, and therefore they couldn't all get together and develop this massive building. This, hopefully is obvious, is not a correct theory, and it seems now much more likely that what happened is that language only happened once, and there was once a single language, and every single language is now an ancestor of that. The earliest really evidence for this was found by Sir William Jones in 1786. He analysed Sanskrit, which was an ancient language spoken in India and surrounding areas. It's no longer with us, but he found various evidence of writing and was able to reconstruct what Sanskrit was like, and then compared it to lots of other languages. And what we find here is we can see that Sanskrit, Latin, Italian, Spanish, French, Greek, Dutch, German, Norwegian, Lithuanian, and Celtic all have similar words. For example, for mother. So for mother, we have mater, mater, madra, madra, mare, and so on. And then the same for three, the number three, similar words for me, and similar words for brother. All suggesting that these languages, although they might superficially seem different, for example, Celtic languages, French, and some of the Indian languages that are spoken now, such as Hindi, are all come from the same root. This is an attempt to try to show the languages here. We can see that this is just one language family, the Indo-European language family, and all of these language families are related to one another. So we can see over the left here, we can find English, which is on the left about halfway up here. English, which is descended from Middle English, which is descended from Old English, which is descended from West Germanic, which is descended from Germanic, which is descended from some hypothetical language spoken by all these people at some point in the past called Proto-Indo-European. Proto just means first, so it's the first Indo-European language. Some of these are quite different from each other. So we've got the Celtic languages, Greek language over here, Iranian, some of the Indian languages, India as in India rather than American Indian languages, the Baltic languages, Slavic languages such as Russian and Polish, all over here. So this is one attempt to unite all of these languages. But this is just one language family. Other language families are things like the Afroasiatic language family, which includes Hebrew, Maltese, Libyan and Ethiopian. Sino-Tibetan is the kind of Chinese languages, but also things like Eskimo. The African languages, the Asiatic languages, the Caucasian languages, which is around Central Asia, Oceanic, which are the languages of New Zealand, Polynesia, Micronesia, Hawaii and Fiji, and then the Native American languages, which include things like Cherokee, Comanche, Sioux, and so on. So these are all different. We've got Indo-European is one language family which unites English to the Indian languages, some of the other Asian languages, and some of the other European languages, and then these are other ones that also thought to exist. This is an attempt to kind of correlate, if you like, different kind of languages with different kind of people. So down here we've got the different kinds of what might sometimes be called races. So Amerind, these are the indigenous people of South and Central America, who are descending themselves from various American people and from Eurasian people, the African peoples here. And this is work by Cavalli Sforza, which shows some interesting things, that some of the language families follow racial groups as well. So the African languages of Khoisan and Congo-Saharan, they're also languages as well as people. So difficult to say what the first language was, but one of the theories about what the first language may have been is that it probably was a subject-verb-object language. So the subject came before the verb and the object came after. But attempts to recreate the first language are very difficult to sustain. If we turn to why language evolved, what's the purpose of language? Why do we have language? We know it's 150,000 years old to 200,000 years old. It's potentially unique to humans. It almost certainly had some effect on our success as a species, the ability to communicate, to share ideas, to coordinate action. The difficult thing is why. There's so many possible benefits for having a language. Trying to pick one is extremely difficult because there's so many good candidates. One interesting way of thinking about this is this question, and this is a question which Tom Scott Phillips posed, which is, when somebody speaks, who usually benefits? Now, quite often when we think about language, we think about it's about information transfer. You know, I tell you something which is useful for you. So in that case, we might think that the beneficiary of speech is the listener, because they learn. The speaker is being altruistic and helping out the listener. However, one of the interesting things is that people who talk too much are usually viewed negatively. You often, say, "Oh, he talks too much." You very rarely hear people say, "Oh, somebody listens too much." Listening is seen as a positive skill. So maybe there's something about that the beneficiary of speech isn't the listener, but maybe it's the speaker. More evidence for this is that although there have been many changes to speech, there are remarkably few changes for listening. So many animals can understand certain aspects of language. Rico the dog is an extreme example, who has the ability to respond to 200 words. So he's learned 200 words doing different commands, but he can't speak a single one. So most of the changes that have evolved for language tend to have evolved for producing it rather necessarily than understanding it. So one argument might be that language isn't about just transferring information so that the receiver benefits. It's maybe about control, the ability to manipulate other people to try them to get them to do what you wish to do. And this is Tom Scott Phillips' argument, that language is essentially not an altruistic act, it's an act of manipulation, and it is the speaker who benefits by trying to get the listener to believe what they say and to bend to their will. So why did language evolve? There are lots of theories. check the book out. Many of these theories are a bit flaky. Terence Deacon said that maybe it's about social contracts. We can make promises, we can promise to do things, we can have marriage, we can make bonds and agreements. So you help me out with this and I'll help you out with that. You help me build a house and I'll help you organize a wedding. That kind of stuff allows us to coordinate action, share things. Problem with that is people lie. Just because you've made a promise doesn't necessarily mean you'll follow it through. Geoffrey Miller argues that it's largely about sexual selection, that it's about, and it's kind of a relation related to that manipulation argument, that it's about mate competition, verbal courtship. Men use language to impress women, and that's a way in which men might persuade women to have sex with them. Women tend to like men who are verbally dexterous, or verbal dexterity is seen as a positive trait. It's been an attractive thing. And he presents that most men are poets. Problem is there's been an issue of the economic dependence of women on men, which means women, until comparatively recently, have found it maybe hard to be poets, not because they're unable to, but because they have not had the financial wherewithal to support themselves. For being a poet, you would probably also find out that most poets were also upper class until comparatively recently. That doesn't necessarily suggest that lower class men are incapable of poetry at all. Again, contradictory to that, women tend to score more highly on tests of verbal fluency, which is possibly a problem with that theory. The social grooming hypothesis is probably a bit more realistic. Dunbar essentially says that many primates use a thing called grooming to form social bonds. They will, most primates are hairy, like chimpanzees and baboons and gorillas, and the hairiness of the bodies tends to harbour parasites such as fleas and ticks, and they want to get rid of these because they're unpleasant, they're uncomfortable, and they can cause disease. So animals will groom each other. So one will sit there and the other one will sit behind it, picking off the little parasites and eating them. So it's an important part of bonding as well. It's not just about parasite removal, because there are things called grooming cliques, where a bunch of different baboons or gorillas will get together and all groom each other. When there's a problem, so if one of them gets threatened by another animal or is in danger, it tends to be members of the grooming clique that come to the rescue. So this may be a way of forming social bonds. These are kind of like, if you want, friendships in these primates. Now Dunbar's argument is that with language you can groom more than one person at a time. You don't need to sit there kind of picking fleas off. You can talk to 4 or 5 people, and that's how you can form social bonds. This, he believed, enabled humans to extend their group size beyond that of other primates, because we can form these bonds through language. We can bond with more people than we can through grooming, so we can form larger group sizes. And here's an example of some research that he's done. And what he's done here, on the y-axis going up here, we've got the mean group size. This is on a logarithmic score, in case you wonder why the y-axis looks very cramped. And then you've got neocortex ratio, which is again on a logarithmic scale. Don't worry about that too much. Neocortex ratio on the bottom here is just the ratio of the new part of the brain, the cortex, to the older parts of the brain. What we find here then, if we then plot mean group size to the brain size essentially, then what we find is the black blobs are what you might wish to call monkeys, and the white blobs are apes. And what you find here is that chimpanzees and bonobos are somewhere around here towards the top, this white circle here. Humans have bigger brain size than chimpanzees, and if you estimate the group size so we know how big the brain of a human is. If we simply take this line here, which is plotted for primates, and read across the right here, it tells us that on average a human should know about 150 people, and work on things as diverse as people's Christmas cards lists, the size of organizations, Facebook friends, how many real friends rather than just imaginary fantasy friends you have on Facebook, supports the idea that human group size may be 150 people. So the argument here is that brain size evolved to support larger and more complex groups. That's why humans have big brains, and one of the ways in which we maintain and organize that group is through language, which is a reason why language may have evolved to sustain large and complex groups.